Welcome, class, to the second section of the Imperialism unit. The first image I just wanted to show you for this section was of these two maps of Africa. You can see the European empires in Africa on the left map, with two exceptions, Ethiopia on the right-hand side, or the east, and Liberia on the west. There are no areas of Africa that are not under control of the European imperial powers. On the modern map of Africa, the legacy I want you to be able to notice is that of the borders, and to consider that what these borders mean when we think about what's going on in Africa today. The focus question is, what were the motivations behind and the impact of the European scramble for Africa? And with those two maps we just looked at, you've already kind of seen a piece of evidence to help you answer the impact question. Initially, in the relationship between Europe and Africa, there cannot help but be mentioned the African slave trade that started in the 1500s. So some of the earliest relationship between European empire was the acquisition of enslaved people from local African kings by Europeans to go live a new life in the Americas in which they were treated as nothing more than property and expendable. That was still a form of indirect control compared to what happened once the slave trade ended in the early 1800s. Without the need to have the enslaved people be brought in by local kings, there was less motivation not to just expand crop plantations or mining operations into the interior of the African continent. So by the 1880s, with new technology and vaccines for things like malaria, or rather medicine for things like malaria, but vaccines for other tropical diseases, Europeans were able to annex most of the formerly independent states, and the whole continent was annexed by the First World War. North Africa also has the added detail of having a religious difference of long standing between Muslim North Africa and the European powers who ended up colonizing most of it. Uh, Muhammad Ali was an Egyptian army general who was able to wrest the territory of modern Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire with some support from the great imperial powers of Britain, of Europe rather, who wanted to see the Ottoman Empire weakened. Ali was able to fend off total imperial control until the British basically saw an opportunity after a canal had been built by a French company with Egyptian support to have a shortcut to their colonies in India, which is right over here. So Britain would be able to save 40% of their journey by taking control of this canal built by this French company. And so they weasel their way into Egypt's finances, made them protectorate, conquer the Sudan, which is this large territory right south of Egypt, in the name of Egypt, but really for Great Britain, and basically exploited the Egyptian people and their territory until they eventually gave them independence in the era past World War II. But it was decades of war and decades of control because of the evolution of this relationship. The Congo is a really interesting story and, in a sense, kind of particular story. There is a gentleman named David Livingston. He's famous for Dr. Livingston, I presume. And that phrase was said by the journalist, American journalist Henry Stanley, who basically went and found this guy, Livingston, who, when he got lost looking for the source of the Nile. Stanley gets famous from this and then effectively becomes the servant, or King Leopold of Belgium becomes his patron, depending on how you want to look at it. And he goes into the Congo River in the center of Africa and uses his fame to attract this investment from the King of Belgium, who ends up setting up an extractive economy, which is one of the most brutal in all of Africa. You can see some of these Congolese workers here in a mine where they're not being compensated, if at all, with anything more than just what they need to survive another day in the mines. And this is especially offensive because the wealth extracted by the King of Belgium was not even close to share with even the elite of the Congolese people. Germany is a country that unifies late. And so it's not until 1880 or so when Germany feels itself confident enough to start looking for colonies because it's, consolidated its national state after unifying in 1870. Chancellor von Bismarck doesn't really care about colonies. He recognizes they're not worth exploiting other people to get because it costs money to do so, and it's not worth the return on investment. But he knows that the German people want to compete with other nations in Europe. So he gets Great Britain and all these other nations, great powers in Europe, to give modern Tanzania and Cameroon to Germany and to kind of establish a set of rules for how the rest of the African continent should be divided up. And so this conference basically makes it so Europe has a set of rules and effectively is able to divide up Africa after that. In South Africa, modern day South Africa, were Dutch. There was originally a Dutch colony, and so the people that settled that of Dutch extraction were named the Boers. They were defeated eventually by the British and taken into the British Empire, but they had a long-standing conflict with the African tribes in the South Africa area, and so the British ended up taking up the conflict with the Zulu. Um, the Zulu initially were able to defeat the British forces, but technology prevailed, and the Zulu were eventually crushed um, by the British and annexed by the British Empire. There's a gentleman named Cecil Rhodes who I'm not going to bore you with too much detail on, but is pretty much the arch imperialist. His goal is to paint as much of Africa red, which is the color that the British Empire was traditionally on maps, and as possible. He was able to personally get the territory of Rhodesia annexed, which is modern day Zambia. And he basically got the Dutch settlers, little kingdom, sorry, not kingdom, statelets, the Boers, into South Africa, losing his political power because he was a horrible racist and got voted out of office. But South Africa became an apartheid, meaning a racially prejudiced, hierarchical state as a result of his kind of manipulations. Famous picture of Cecil Rhodes. You know, he wants the Egyptian colony of Great Britain up here and the South African colony, and this is a telegraph wire. So it was strung up along the road of what was eventually supposed to become the Cape to Cairo Railroad, which never got finished because imperialism was done before the railroad could have gotten done after World War II. Um, and later issues made it so it didn't happen, although there are groups that say they want to do it. So this is supposed to be progress. Cecil Rhodes is happy with his work, although he never asked any of the African peoples for their permissions. Basically, being exploited is something that causes resistance. And just like in Southeast Asia, the Western education and these new middle classes from the newly industrializing, in most cases, colonies, helped create a African nationalism, just like it had done in Southeast Asia. And because it became clearer to these people, because they had the tools, just exactly how greedy the European imperial powers and American and Japanese eventually were being with their acquisition in the world.